oh, well, the US does the same thing, in fact, they do worse things, you know? And it's like, sure, but that doesn't totally negate, the
Mhm.
argument that we should be, still critical of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Should
Mhm.
absolutely be critical of these folks.
Here's the problem is that there's this highly liturgical part of the left. It really cannot filter anything through a lens not just sort of Marxism, but of a highly sort of liturgical reading of
Right,
Marxism. And
right.
the result of that is an impulse to sort of make these defenses. But I think that what people on the left in the 21st century need to do, people who are
Mhm,
post Maoist, post Leninist, it's incumbent on us to do is to say that these projects ended up becoming, slave to the impulses and motivations of the modern state and its adjacent ruling classes, right? And that being
mhm.
Marxist, being socialist, being communist, right, was eventually just sort of a rhetorical device in these places that, for a whole range of reasons, they, sort of had to take on, right, as they were trying to be states that were opposed by the United States, by the world's most significant military superpower. But the things that were carried out in China and the Soviet Union, I don't think it's about measuring against the United States, like in some sort of comparative act. I think it's about
Yeah,
synthesizing and understanding that there really isn't like a significant difference between the methods here, because at the end of the day, the reasons that China and the Soviet Union act the way they act isn't because of socialism or Marxism. It's because of the modern state. And so you have to be willing to have that critique on the left. But
mhm,
the thing is that the more statist elements of the left, and especially the very statist liturgical part of the Marxist left, still puts up this defense to a little bit, right? And
yeah,
so when you hear
yeah.
like Richard Wolff or like other people sort of like on the left today tiptoeing around it, it's because they're trying to sort of like, not alienate that part of the left.
Which is just absurd to me, like, just call it what it is, like.
Yeah, and see that, and this is sort of my problem with it, with that sort of part of the left. Because I mean, you'll talk, sometimes you'll get into spaces and you'll be talking to people who really can't talk about like revolution, basically,
Yeah,
outside of the context of early 20th century Russia. Like,
mhm,
and they don't really seem to process the fact that this is a different historical moment, that like those dynamics are not historical constants. They can't really describe to you an organizing tactic that doesn't sort of like, I don't know, assume that the Romanovs are still in power.
right,
And I
yeah,
think that's kind of the irritating thing as somebody does have some like academic experience with these like ideologies and their histories, is that it's incumbent on us to do something else at this point.
yeah,
And
right,
especially if we've gotten to the point of defending states like China. And I think that this is the thing, and this is probably where I want to like come back in after the thing, is that in China, ever since the 90s, essentially, we've been looking at a state capitalist project,
yeah,
right?
that's what I was gonna get at earlier, was, like, there's this incredible misconception about operating under the guise of communism, calling yourself the Chinese Communist Party when you are nothing more than, a large surveillance state, utilizing state capitalism, essentially, and committing, human rights
Right.
atrocities and stuff like that, and that's.
The difference between the authoritarian left and the authoritarian right at the end of the day, because when we say authoritarian, we're talking about people who are maximalists in terms of state power, right?
Mhm,
The state power maximalists on the left and the state power maximalists on the right basically agree about how to use the state, but the difference is do their economic policies produce and prop up a
Right.
capitalist ruling class. And that is the difference between like fascism and communism at the end of the day, is what are your economic policies trying to
Yeah.
create? And in China, since they've begun their state capitalist program, it's effectively fascism, right? Like
Yeah.
at the point at which you
They have
have,
a supreme state, ruling class of elites, rich elites and stuff.
but that state capitalism is the critical feature of like actual Hitlerian fascism. Like when we talk about
Mhm.
the characteristics of National Socialism
Yeah,
in
Nazism, yeah.
Germany,
Yeah.
right? Like Nazism, that we're talking about that critical difference because
Mhm.
I think it's fair to point out that left authoritarianism has produced similar sort of like ethnic cleansing type events, similar sort of
Yeah,
mass incarceral types
right.
of events, right? And that these are things that the modern state does, right? You can't, like, liberals did that. Liberals invented the concentration camp and the ethnic cleanse and all this thing, because these are characteristics of the modern state, not any of these like particular liberal left or conservative ideologies. And
Mhm.
so it's the failure to sort of like have this dialogue between authoritarianism and anarchism on the left, right, that leads us to having to, you know, talk to people who are still basically living in 1917.
So I wanted to discuss all the hoopla surrounding
Hoopla.
the recent passage of the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, not only for its current geopolitical relevance, but also because next week Michael and I are planning to talk with previous guest Frank Milburn about China, Russia, and UFOs, and unexplained aerial phenomena, and how those things are connected. And so a component of this year's NDAA is the Gillibrand, or Kirsten Gillibrand, sorry, Amendment UFO Office, something that, like a very specific component of that legislation that we support, not saying we support the rest of it. I want to kind of clarify that. So,
So we're
yeah,
detractors of the NDAA broadly.
right. And so, I want to, like, you know, for those listening, kind of articulate why we're specifically supporters of that very specific component, that we're talking about here. And that's because we are essentially hopefully getting the anti-Project Blue Book with this office. And for those who are, aware of what Project Blue Book was, it was basically a public relations campaign to disseminate misinformation and disinformation to the American public on the topic of UFOs. And the chief scientist who ran it, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, you know, it became a major critic of the program itself years later, and said that was the
Mhm.
whole purpose of it, was to
Right.
convince the American people that this wasn't an actual thing, and it worked wondrously. Now, beyond the impending creation of this UFO office, mandated by the law, we have some funky stuff going on in the rest of the legislation in regards to the U.S. government's sort of strategy against China. And there is a Jacobin magazine article that I'm going to kind of reference as we sort of talk about China and begin this discussion a little bit,
Mhm.
because this article, and Michael Clare, who wrote the article, kind of does a good job sort of illustrating that a lot of this bill has to do with basically encircling China,
Mhm.
um, in containment. He kind of begins this article writing, the word encirclement does not appear in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, signed into law by President Joe Biden on December 27th, or in other recent administration statements about its foreign and military policies. Nor does the classic Cold War era term containment ever come up. Still, America's top leaders have reached a consensus on a strategy to encircle and contain the latest great power, China, with hostile military alliances, thereby thwarting its rise to full superpower status.
It's been interesting to me to listen to, liberals who have, in a lot of ways, not sort of killed the George Kennan in their head, and that there's a whole lot of people who basically do still subscribe to containment as like a successful doctrine of foreign policy. Containment as a principle was essentially disproven by what happened in Southeast Asia, and I think that's something that's often sort of missed. Is that, and that's for two reasons. The first being that at the time the monolithic aspirations of the Third Communist International were exaggerated, right? And the threat posed by that pole of global power were exaggerated, and that the capacity of these places to really sort of organize and project themselves coherently, and we're talking like sort of at the height of the Sino-Soviet alliance, these things did not exist at the level that we were led to believe. And so when you hear liberals talk about containment, what they're misunderstanding is that, and then also that the reason we contained, communism
Yeah.
in Southeast Asia is not because of, a vindication of the domino theory or of intervention in Vietnam and Laos, but it was genocide in Indonesia, right? That these are the tactics, right? Not containment, but the genociding of hundreds of thousands, millions, if you depending on whose side you're taking, in the genocide in Indonesia, which the United States sponsored. And so, because we don't ever say that, right? That's not really sort of in the in the ferment of liberal, historical ideology and remembrance. You can still hear very reasonable liberals talk about containment seriously, and and that's what Claire's pointing out here in this article.
I'll just start the next paragraph here. The Chinese state has turned into a massive surveillance entity hell bent on monitoring each and every one of its citizens down to the keystrokes on their phones and computers. They've rounded up Uyghur Muslims and effectively placed them into internment camps in desolated parts of the country, away from prying eyes of the country's major metropolitan centers. And their own version of imperialism threatens peace in the Pacific and much of East Asia. Why not take a few pages from the playbook of their Western rivals? Here's where all this becomes even more of an issue. The US intelligence community obviously recognizes the growing threat of China against the interests of the US elite, especially those in the Pacific and East Asia region. And as a result, we have begun to rapidly accelerate our own plans of what are effectively containment of the Chinese geopolitical strategy to its own current territory. So that should go over well with the Chinese state, right? I had always sort of thought historically this is like a thing that's been going on straight, for 20, 30 years. But like the sort of rapid acceleration that we're seeing right now with the Biden administration really only took off during the final years of the Trump administration, which is interesting. Like in my head, I was thinking like, okay, this has been some kind of adopted policy that, the US state has just had constantly through presidential administrations, for the past 30 years. And like we saw a little bit of it with the Bush administration. So like Claire writes, the notion of surrounding China with a chain of hostile powers was, in fact, first promoted as official policy in the early months of the President George W. Bush's administration. At the time, Vice President Dick Cheney and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice went to work establishing an anti-China alliance system in Asia, following guidelines laid out by Rice in a January 2000 article in Foreign Affairs. There, she warned of Beijing's efforts to quote, alter Asia's balance of power in its own favor, end quote, a drive the United States must respond to by deepening quote, its cooperation with Japan and South Korea, end quote, and by, quote, maintaining its commitment to a robust military presence in the region, end quote.
Mhm. It might be worth here, like sketching out kind of like a history, like a rough history of China, and a little bit of a rough history of like U.S. attitudes and ideologies towards them. And I
Mhm.
think that and to sort of set up this conversation, I think that we'll sort of continue having next week is to say, so China on sort of the grand historical scale, right, is very much sort of the center of civilization, right, the center of increasing complexity and advancement in social development. And for a range of reasons, both domestic and international, the Chinese state spent the better part of the last millennia uh, falling sort of increasingly behind the West in its development of state bureaucracies and the mechanisms of the modern state. Keep in mind, these are things which reach their height in Eastern Asia and Central Asia as well, long before the West and its more recent, superiority in their ability to sort of corral material and use it towards their national improvement. The range of factors that have contributed to that
Mhm.
and contributed to the sort of like rough, colonization of China into different sort of, economic zones and protectorates of Europe in the 19th century. As that comes to an end in the early 20th century, you have this opening of China. You have sort of like this 20-year period of like liberalization. It's sort of in this space that a communist left begins, flourishes, right?
Right.
And then so it's in that context that you get Mao and Maoism and all this sort of stuff. China in 1949, right, as you see China go into revolution and transition to the Maoist Chinese state that it argues it is now, you begin to see these same sort of domestic tendencies towards sort of isolation reassert themselves, and then also retaliation against China on the part of the major economic powers. Uh, they the alliance with the Soviets breaks down, um, and and so all this time, right, as China's going through this sort of process, culminating with their shift towards state capitalism in the 90s, right, that the United States has, for even still the majority of its history, tried to argue for what's been called a special relationship, right, with China. That the United States actually, as China is being partitioned by European powers in the 19th century, the United States is arguing for China's like independence and opening, right? Because it has economic interests, of course, because it doesn't. The United States and its elite didn't have access to the economic engine of China because it had been divided up amongst the Europeans. So the United States spends a lot of this time arguing, sort of for a type of nationalism in China that would open it to U.S. economic interests. And so, but so yeah, so by the time sort of all of this is taking place, this sort of moment of communism in China, the United States has otherwise kind of been a proponent, but they've been a proponent of a very sort of particular class in China. And that was the class that was represented by Chiang Kai shek and the emergent bourgeoisie in China, right? The group that flees across the sea to Taiwan. This was our alliance in China, right? It was throughout the Second World War, right? And it remained Chinese when China turned red. But so that's sort of a context to this antagonism. I think is important, right? That this is largely born out of the coincidences of China finally reaching a state of like sort of vaguely nationalist self-determination at precisely the moment that the United States became the world superpower. And then they flip, right? And the United States becomes very anti-China, right? And whereas they had sort of you could have almost seen the United States as being pro China, or at least pro Chiang Kai shek, pro free market forces intervening in China and allowing them to trade and profit from a relationship with them.
Mhm.
Do you remember like reading like a Times for kid, like a Time for Kids issue, like in like like sometime between like kindergarten and third grade, um, talking about in very favorable terms these changes towards state capitalism that were going on in China, these economic zones and this increasing like freedom
Mhm.
for the Chinese middle class and all this. This was all received relatively positively up until it became apparent that China would be a challenger
Right.
to the
Now
United
it's
States and its interests in the region.
yeah, now it's time to encircle. So,
Right.
um,
Pull out the old playbook.
I'll continue here with what Claire has written. So he writes, this has in fact remained part of the governing U.S. global playbook ever since, even if for the Bush team. Its implementation came to an abrupt halt on September 11th, 2001, when Islamic militants attacked the Twin Towers in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., leading the administration to declare a global war on terror. So, only a decade later, in 2011, he writes, did official Washington return to the Rice Cheney strategy of encircling China and blunting or suppressing its growing power. That November, in an address to the Australian Parliament, President Obama announced an American pivot to Asia, a drive to restore Washington's dominance in the region, while enlisting its allies there in an intensifying effort to contain China. Obama said, as president, I have made a deliberate and strategic decision, he declared in Canberra. As a Pacific nation, the United States will play a larger and long term role in shaping this region and its future. As we end today's wars in the Middle East, I have directed my national security team to make our presence and mission in the Asia Pacific a top priority. He kind of also points out that like strategy towards China took a little bit of a backseat, as we're still sort of in the midst of the war on terror. And then this winds down obviously as we get into the Trump administration. And then in the latter years of the Trump administration, this this rapid acceleration of
Hmm.
this strategy takes off. And so Claire continues, led by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the Trump effort proved far more substantial, involving, as it did, the beefing up of U.S. forces in the Pacific, closer military ties with Australia, Japan, and South Korea, and an intensified outreach to India. Pompeo also added several new features to the mix, a quadrilateral alliance between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, dubbed the Quad for short, increased diplomatic ties with Taiwan, and the explicit demonization of China and of China as an enemy of Western values. In a July 2020 speech at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, Pompeo laid out the new China policy vividly to prevent the Chinese Communist Party from demolishing the rules based order that our societies have worked so hard to build. He declared, we must draw common lines in the sand that cannot be washed away by the CCP's bargains or their blandishments. This required not only bolstering U.S. forces in Asia, but also creating a NATO like alliance system to curb China's further growth. Claire writes, on entering the White House, President Biden promised to reverse many of the unpopular policies of his predecessor, but strategy towards China was not among them. Indeed, his administration has embraced the Pompeo encirclement agenda with a vengeance. As a result, ominously enough, preparations for a possible war with China are now the Pentagon's top priority, as, for the State Department, is the further isolation of Beijing diplomatically. Like, as we kind of discussed earlier, we have issues with China and its role sort of in the global theater and whatnot. The strategy being adopted by the US state,
Hmm.
doesn't exactly sound like a recipe for long-term peace
I,
whatsoever.
I think our historical moment bears a lot of similarity with the pre World War One moment,
Mhm.
and the similarity, isn't one to one, of course, but it lies in this state and capital crisis of, in the case of the First World War, having largely kind of divided the market up into sort of like post mercantile imperial systems that were internally, driven by a market and capital, but which were sort of, separate from each other. The analog to that now, right, is that the diminishing rate of return on profits and capital has intensified this crisis, right? That we have sort of used up the, competitive advantage, free market oomph that sort of staved off these conflicts after the Second World War. And so the similarity, right, is that there's very little for capital in the modern state to do now, except for create a crisis like this,
Yeah.
because there isn't another way out of the dilemma of diminishing capital returns, of diminishing marginal rate of profit. And on top of that, right, the Western capitalist system is entering basically a state of crisis, both ecological and economic. And
Right.
alongside that, they're at a risk of being overtaken, by China. And so we're back to that same, prisoner's dilemma of the First World War, right? Which
Mhm.
is there anything else for us to do to maintain these structures, to maintain the hegemony of the United States, except for have this conflict?
Mhm.
And that's the, congruity, I think, between this and the First World War, and
Yeah.
that sort of inevitability. And I think that we see, like, I think if once we get even like another 50 years or so down the road, we're going to kind of see that, there was sort of like a 50 years war, and and that spark was not concluded until until 1945, arguably, 1949, 1950, before you have the East all sutured up, right? And that going all the way back to the war between, Japan and the Russians at the turn of the century, up to its conclusion, with revolution in China and Korea, that
Yeah.
this 50 years of rupture, what we would call a 50 years war, if we had a little bit more removal from it, is something that we're sort of teetering on the brink of, and arguably, and to sort of step even further into the future, have been building towards since 2001. What I think this conversation will be useful for is that there is a point in the interview with Frank where we'll ask him, sort of in light of what we've sort of bounced through here, why should like a normal person um, pick a side at all in the coming conflict, right? And I
Mhm.
think that that's what one of the reasons that we're going to talk to Frank about this topic is because
Yeah.
I'm skeptical that
He
a
he has a
normal
very
person should,
yeah.
should take a position on it. And I suspect that that is very much not Frank Milburn's position on the coming conflict.
Maybe, but he has a very interesting kind of response. I don't know if you listened to all of his
Yep,
his interview on that UFO podcast,
yep. I
because
should
it's
this
really
week.
good. Yeah, you should because I think there should be some continuation of that conversation in what we're gonna
You're
discuss
right.
with him. Um, because I mean, he very much articulates his issues with, like, humanity. He's not out there, I think, because they kind of brush on what we're talking about here a little bit, and, he kind of says himself that, like, humanity kinda really sucks, and he is not someone who wants to see this. He's saying basically the as someone, in Western intelligence that, like, this is the inevitability, and I'm not someone who's advocating for us to go to war with China. I'm just saying that here's
Yeah,
here's here's what's going to happen,
because
basically.
I guess the thing that I want to sort of spar with him is like, well, why is that, right? And I think that it's kind of inescapable that it's that we have not pulled down the the Westphalian order of realist
Yeah,
mercantilist states, right?
yeah,
And that they're now producing in the 21st century a
right,
similar set of dynamics and circumstances that they did in the early 20th century, and that it's incumbent upon people who are aware of that to say it, right? And to not get like pulled into one sort of nationalist agenda or another, you know. The critical thing is to understand that, ethnic cleansing, concentration camps, all of these depravities, right, are contained within the modern state, right? Not within a particular ideology of it, but that this is now observably, with about a century and a half to go on, just something that it does. And that it's done it, whether we're talking about, the Germans in Africa or in Europe, whether we're talking about the Spanish in
right,
Cuba or in their own country, right?
yeah,
That these are inescapable things that the
mhm,
state does, right?
yeah,
And so to sit here and say, oh well, China is currently engaged in using its modern state that way, and we have a historical memory of the time that the Soviets used their state that way, and we don't, we're not super critical of, whatever you make of re-education camps for indigenous people's children, or the reservation, or, like whatever our euphemisms are for when we were engaged in these activities, that there's a hypocrisy, right, in saying we have to take this side in this nationalist conflict because we're different, right? And I think that here's the, and here's sort of the flip side to it, is that there is nothing more damaging to people, right? The very people that you are crying crocodile tears for ginning up a war effort. The worst thing you could do to those folks is, subject them to a total modern war scenario, right? That, and I think that that's kind of the thing you have to decide is, you know, whether or not modern war is the worst thing that you can actually do to people. And I think
mhm,
there's a pretty strong argument to say it is. That, whether we're talking about nuclear war or conventional war or proxies or whatever, right? That's the worst thing you can do to people. As awful as repression is, right? That short of literal actual death camps, it's hard to argue that there's anything worse you can do to folks other than total war.
mhm. I had a thought too. I was kind of thinking about where climate change sort of shapes the geopolitical picture in the future, and it's like I almost wonder if like Indo-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific is going to basically become the next sort of like vacuum, like the Middle East a little bit, as like what will probably be the world's largest or the largest refugee crisis in the history of the world
Mhm.
um, transpires.
In
And
Bangladesh and other
yeah,
places.
none of these countries have the resources to move people within like 10 years, basically.
Yeah,
As the the
right.
the ocean just floods the whole damn thing, and so
And they
like
sure as hell won't if we fight the next world war there.
you'll have the United States, wanting to come in and police the region, but
Mhm.
they're going to be using their own material interests, to compete with China in the region as it becomes more of a vacuum. So, and like you just said, that is the perfect place for a conflict between the United States or the West and China to take place.
When I've said this to the dirtbag libs, as I'll go
Yeah.
ahead and lob back at them, the type of like liberal who's like very anti-Trump but also has like an American flag in his Twitter profile picture,
Mhm.
right? Like that kind of guy will literally come back at you. Like you can sort of like lay out all of this stuff and its historical complexity and its ideological relativity and all this sort of stuff. And they will literally come back at you with, well, I want my children to have freedom. I like freedom. And liberals, like the hair on fire, Trump hating, Jan 6 fearing liberals will tell you that they have to oppose China
Mhm.
because of freedom, right? And I think that this is sort of another incongruity between, you know, what we're saying and what we're doing, which is that that is a disingenuous representation of the agenda of China.
Yeah.
The extent of China's interests are regional, and to the extent that they are opposed in their regional interest, it is by us with an
Mhm.
imperial interest on the other
Right.
side of the planet.
Yeah.
And so to talk about China retaking Taiwan like it threatens your children's freedom in the United States is absurd. I mean, that that's like I think you're an op. If that's like something, if you like have like 10 to 15,000 followers on Twitter and like you say that stuff, like I genuinely would expect the CIA to deny that you're an employee, because that like that's the kind of stuff that led
Yeah.
me to write a Medium article last month, or maybe at the end of November, about how liberals and progressives will take us to war. It's because
Mhm.
of that kind of nationalism. It's because there are hair on fire, supposedly anti-fascist liberals who will say that stuff, and they're the ones who will take us to war, because the Joe Biden Democrats are going to be able to guilt those people into thinking that opposing China and supporting some sort of nationalist conflagration is about freedom. And that's libs and that's conservatives, right?
Mhm.
That is in the national milieu.
So the thing that I really wanna, like, address in this discussion, and we can go further into it next week with Frank, is how do you deal with China without utilizing the tool of war, basically? Because you can't, no, but seriously, because we can't sit and say, "Oh, we just don't deal with China," because you can't. China's still gonna do imperialist stuff just like we will, and they're still gonna commit human rights atrocities and stuff like that. Their surveillance state is only going to grow and become more prevalent. Now, obviously that leaves the door open for, do the Chinese people rise up at some point if it gets that bad? I don't know, but we're also talking about, like, the revolution's like a weird topic for me nowadays, especially in like a state like China, because yeah, revolution can transpire, it has transpired on a massive scale, but I worry about how effective like a revolution could be in a state like China, given how advanced the surveillance state is
Mhm.
there, for example, in the technology being utilized by the state. I think that's a variable a lot of people don't consider, and even in the United States too. That I think that applies. So I
I
don't know.
think.
For me, I don't know what the strategy is for keeping the peace between the West and,
Mhm.
East Asia, basically. I don't have a good answer. I mean, I'll be completely honest.
And to just sort of track where we are in the conversation is that I have gone to this point of kind of articulating that, like, as a class, right? As a person of average and modest means, I don't think I have an interest in the question, which is how do you deal with China, right? That's a that
I don't
the
either,
Well,
but
that's what I'm saying, right? Is
yeah,
that like, and I'm not making that point to like say that the question you've posed isn't important, but
yeah.
just to say that I think there's an overabundance
Mhm.
of people who think they do have an interest in that. And they're the people who would say,
Right,
I
right.
oppose China because of, like, I think that they're coming for my children's right to vote in this society where public opinion and voting have no correlation on policy outcomes or agendas, right? Like they
Yeah.
think that, and this is the way it sort of fits into this other constellation, is that they think that like supporting the American state has a value on similar grounds, right? That they want freedom for their children.
I think it's the reason why I'm asking the question is because I think it's valid in even people on the left, I don't think should necessarily, like, ignore what that question means, even if it doesn't pertain to you, like you were saying earlier. as you said, China invading Taiwan,
Right.
affects my children's freedom and that sort of thing. Like, that's not necessarily what I'm getting at. It's just that, like, China very much, just like the United States, equally threatens, you know, peace basically around the world and that sort of thing. And so my question for people is, how is the impending conflict between China and the United States, the West, I should say, dealt with, that doesn't involve nuclear Armageddon and a bunch of people just fucking dying, basically? And I don't have a good answer for that question. It's also like really, really naive for people to just ignore this and just say that it's, people on the left
Sure.
to say that
Sure.
that it isn't an issue, because, like, or it's really naive for people on the left to say, "Oh, we just don't go to war with China," or we don't, or like we just ignore them. Basically, there's
Right.
this really gray area where I don't think there's a good answer for how to address the situation and maintain peace.
Your point is that like peace is a value,
Mhm.
um, and like China threatens it, right? And I think that this is what brings me back to my point about the incongruity of our objectives versus the actual
Yeah.
objectives of the Chinese state, right? Is
We
that
could be
we
sitting in
the
Beijing right now as 2 Chinese, grad students having the same conversation about the US threatening peace here.
Mhm.
It's it can go either way.
But I think that there is a meaningful difference between China taking Taiwan and us sailing nuclear submarines off the coast of
Yes.
China,
Yes.
right? And I
100%.
think that
Yes.
that's sort of, so when you say, well, how do we deal with China? What you're saying is, how do we stop China from expressing their regional interest with our empire on the other side of the world?
Yeah.
And
Yes, I'm saying, how do we address another major world superpower doing the imperialism
Mhm.
game, basically?
There's been a lot of like international legislation and a lot of moralizing about how like aggressive warfare, air quotes, right? Like basically when nations and interests outside of the mainstream of the global politic begin to express themselves, right? These things end up being termed aggressive warfare, right? And that aggressive warfare is the worst thing a state can do, right? I mean, I think we know that
Yeah.
that's kind of included in our assumption that total warfare is the worst thing that you could do to the people of Taiwan or the people of Ukraine, right?
Right.
And that basic physic of even my argument assumes the premise of this international regime that has prevailed since 1945, right? And so, but the problem with that is that it largely is a reaction to the failures of appeasement in dealing with the Nazi state, right? Is that, and this is what they'll say, right? Is that the reason we can't let China take Taiwan is because then where do they stop, right? And I think that this logic, right, of imperialism, a country like Japan can't attempt what it attempts without our imperialist premise. A country like China can't, or the Soviet Union, right, doesn't conceptualize a global empire without it first having been born of liberalism, right? And
Right.
so this is sort of the contradiction we're sort of living in here. Is it's like we're really talking about using the mechanism of empire to prevent another empire from being born, right? And so like, so I don't think there's an easy answer. Well, what do you do with China? Well, what do you do about empire, right? What do you do about the problems of realist nation states expressing their interest and doing so through violence, right? Because they're going,
Mhm.
I mean, they do, that's what they do. That's what the modern state does. And so when you ask, well, what do we do about China? Right? Like I think that it's the doing something about China, right? The same way that two grad students in Beijing might say, well, what do we do about uh, you know, the US preventing us from expressing
Right.
our
Yeah.
right to take Taiwan, right?
Yeah.
Like that the problem here is that you and I and two grad students in Beijing have the same actual interest, right?
Mhm.
And so this sort of like Monday morning quarterbacking of like, well, what should the bourgeoisie do about China? What should the
Right.
modern state do about China? It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically as useful as saying, well, what should like, or if we were sitting here and discussing, well, what should
Mhm.
China do about the U.S. preventing us from taking Taiwan?
The core of what I'm getting at is that it's so abundantly clear right now that the groundwork for absolute catastrophe affecting the human species is being laid right now. The foundation for this is occurring. It's happening. And we're going to get into it next week with what I just said, how much more prevalent that is like with the involvement of, UAP technology and stuff like that and the hunt for it,
Right.
and to make it work
Right.
among China, Russia, and the United States,
Mhm.
basically. And so like
And if you go
my
back and listen to our Frank Milburn interview, that the role of this weapons platform in that
mhm,
conflict, right, is incredibly central, right? It is the next
yeah,
frontier of
yeah.
global dominance.
I think Frank, I mean, he can if he listens to this, he can correct us on the next episode. But I mean, I think he's essentially said he's talked to scientists who basically say that we have to we need to be at the level of like what the Tic Tac UFO was doing to the USS Nimitz, technologically speaking, so we can have that dominance in
First.
preparation for China,
Yeah. Right.
basically. And that is staggering to me.
And this is the
Absolutely
framework,
staggering.
and what's frustrating is that you have, and I think this is true when you look at sort of the journalism that the Intelcom and former Intelcom people are doing right now on this topic, is that you have this sense that they are like complex intellectual individuals, right, who do kind of at their core want to see humanity improved and bettered and all of this sort of
Mhm.
stuff, but are having to, at the end of the day, justify the research they're doing under national security pretenses
Mhm.
and premises,
Yeah.
right? And it's that force that is sort of moving us towards this conflagration, right?
Right.
And it's not because people doing that research are causing it, but because that is the entire orientation of the system, right? And it's reached that point because I don't know if you can feel it, but if you look around you, it would be really good right now, for us to have to spend a whole bunch of money and gin up the economy on a war effort. It would be really good right now if we could make a whole bunch of money, loaning to countries who have to rebuild stuff that we blew up. That would be that would save capitalism right now. You could probably buy another 50 years of this. I mean,
Mhm.
impending ecological doom aside, you could probably buy another 50 to 100 years of this with one great global conflagration that stopped just short of nuclear war.
Yeah.
And I think that is the thing that capitalism is contemplating right now, is
Mhm.
this deep understanding that we can't reiterate this society any further without a significant purge of like existing capital in the form of
Yeah.
a global conflict. This is an independently produced podcast.